cell phone, drop it in my purse, and give me that. And you've done your servant leadership.
I'm sorry.
All good. No, there were people ready to watch starting at 11. So if it was 10:30, I was gonna.
No, that was correct.
We're all good.
Welcome to everyone here at Texas Public Policy Foundation today. My name is Dr. Richard Johnson, and I'm the director of the Booker T. Washington Initiative. And I'm really glad to be hosting and also moderating this book talk, because it really hits home when we talk about parents deserve agency in education. And our guest is really going to tell us a lot about agency. And we're so glad to have all of you that are viewing online, because we hope that it's our hope and prayer that you learn something today that will not only just help you, your schools, your families, but also Texas and America. And we're joined today by our author, Mr. Ian Rowe. And I'm a big fan. I've had an opportunity to read your book, and I'm just really, really excited about what folks are going to learn from this conversation. Ian is a senior fellow at American Enterprise Institute. He's a co-founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, a new network in schools in terms of the Bronx, South Bronx, New York. You're really doing it. And he's also the co-founder of the National Summer School Initiative. He's a senior visiting fellow at Woodson Institute, Woodson Center. And he's published with New York Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the Washington Examiner. Ian holds an MBA from Harvard Business School, where he was the first Black editor-in-chief of the Harvard Business and School newspaper. Yep. This guy is just full of stuff. And has a BS in computer science engineering from Cornell University. And we also have Dr. Swain, our very own Dr. Swain. She's a distinguished senior fellow from the Constitutional Studies here at Texas Public Policy Foundation, my colleague. She's an award-winning political scientist, a former tenured professor at Princeton and Vanderbilt universities. She's an expert on critical race theory. She's written and edited over 11 books. One is one of my favorites, Black Eye for America, How Critical Race Theory is Burning Down the House. She's been on numerous TV. She's made numerous television appearances. She's everywhere. And she's also an entrepreneur, owns her own business, Carol Swain Enterprises and Unity Training Solution Enterprises, LLC. She holds 5 degrees, a PhD from University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill, and an MSL from Yale. Welcome, Ian Rowe and Dr. Carol Swain.
Thank you.
Ian, tell us a little bit about how you got involved in this education space, and what's the nucleus that basically made you want to go out and do this work all over the country?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thank you for having me. It's quite an honor to be flanked by 2 quite distinguished colleagues. And I've been looking forward to this discussion. In terms of what has led me to this moment to be really concerned about young people and this idea of building agency for the rising generation, is that I myself am the product of an incredible public school education, kindergarten through 12th grade. My parents came to this country from Jamaica, West Indies in the late 1960s in search of the American dream. And they believe that this country, even with all of the issues that were quite evident in the late 1960s, all the racial strife, they saw that the Civil Rights Act had just been passed, the Voting Rights Act, that the country was changing. And even in the face of discrimination, there were still structures and institutions like strong families, strong faith commitment, strong access to education that they felt would make a huge difference in the lives of their two children that were coming here. And when you ask, why do I do the work I do today? You know, there is a story I often share of when I was 12 years old. Because when my parents first came to the United States, we lived in Brooklyn. And after a few years, we moved on up to Queens. We moved, if you remember the Jefferson's reference, but we moved to a small, moving on up, exactly. We moved to a small town called Laurelton, Queens, which had been a predominantly white neighborhood, you know, Jewish and Italian enclave, was slowly becoming more racially integrated as more Black families were moving in. And unfortunately, there were an increasing number of racial incidents as a result of the increasing integration. And my junior high school 231, was almost the epicenter of a lot of these events. And our local school board, to solve the problem, they decided to create and annex another junior high school in Rosedale, which was a town a couple miles over, but that was more predominantly white, right? Mm-hmm. And so what all of the white parents in my junior high school decided to do was take their kids out of junior high school 231 and send them to this annex school. And my Jamaican parents, on the premise that where the white kids go, that's where the better education will be, we're going to send me to this other school. And, you know, my parents would have crawled through broken glass for me and my brother to ensure that we had every opportunity in life. I had never questioned my parents about anything. But in this moment, something didn't seem right. And on the Sunday night before the Monday morning that the transfer papers had to be submitted, I did something that I thought I would never do. I challenged my parents. This was the unthinkable thing. And, you know, my dad was in his recliner. My mom was in the sofa in the living room, where we'd had many family conversations. But in this moment, I begged my parents not to transfer me to this other school. Why did this other school just was inherently better because that's where the white kids go? Why did our school have to be worse simply because now is going to be, you know, a segregated all Black school? I love my teachers. I love my school. And I just did the unthinkable. I kept pressing my parents. And then they did the unthinkable, which was that they relented. For the first time I can really remember, my parents did something that they did not want to do as related to my education. But I now call what I experienced then my first experience with what I now define as agency. That in that moment, I felt a greater level of ownership, like I had real skin in the game. I had convinced my parents to do something they didn't want to do. So I had a level of ownership that I couldn't walk away from. And I call it now my coming of agency moment. And so when I think about the work that I do today, there's no doubt that the relationship, the thought that I had at that moment, at 12 years old, the demographic makeup of an institution, who cares what it is in terms of what the expectations should be for everyone who's in that institution. And that is something that has carried me throughout my career, you know, running schools or working for foundations, all working for AEI, now, you know, opening up a new international baccalaureate high school in the Bronx. You know, we don't have to wait for someone else to show up in order for the education to be exceptional. Mm-hmm. right? It's a really important message. So that experience very early, I think, helped shape almost everything that I do today.
And Dr. Swain, you have lived an interesting life. And it's so rich. It's so rich with growth and development. Share with myself and the audience here, what brought you to this point? Let's give us a little bit about your journey, because you have a very interesting journey.
Well, this point now is that I'm very focused on education, anti-CRT, what's happening in this country. And I think a lot of that was fueled by my own journey, if not all of it. I was one of 12 children born and raised in rural poverty, Southwestern Virginia. I dropped out of school after the 8th grade. I married at 16, had my first child by 17. By the time I was 21, I had 3 small children. People came into my life and encouraged me, and I earned a high school equivalency. I went to a community college and got the first of 5 college and university degrees. Never sought to become a university professor, but people steered me into it. And what I can tell you about my early experiences was that I went to segregated schools. I was born in 1954, and it took until the end of the 60s for Virginia to integrate. And I had always heard that, that the white people had the better books, and I thought that they were smarter than we were. And when I got to the integrated schools, I learned that I had been smart in the Black schools and I was smart in the white schools. And so that sort of broke that belief that white people were somehow smarter. But I have achieved the American dream and have been, successful. And I can tell you that I didn't have anyone telling me that because I was Black and poor, what I couldn't do. And I believe that if I worked hard and got an education, I would be able to overcome the circumstances of my birth. And I did. And the people that came into my life and steered me and encouraged me, for the most part, they happened to be white, many of them white men. And the predominantly Black schools I was in, I was poor. I was po. And the middle class, Black teachers, they were not too interested in children like me. They were interested in other teachers' children's or Blacks that were more middle class. And so I can say that I didn't get the same kind of encouragement. I actually believe you had to be rich to go to college. I did not know that was even a possibility. But my story is complicated because I can't say that was why I dropped out of school. There were other factors. I hope to write my memoir and have it published next year that talks about the backstory. So there are a lot of factors in the story, but the most important thing that I learned is the power of words to change lives. Because, there was a medical doctor, white, that was probably, I know how old he was because we reacquainted ourselves about 3 years ago, but he was 5 years older than me, that told me I was intelligent, that I was attractive, I could do more with my life, and no one had told me that. And he caused me to think about myself differently. He was a factor in my getting my high school equivalency and making a decision to take a job outside the home. There was an African orderly from Sierra Leone, a Muslim, that told me that he went to college with a lot of people that were not as smart as I was. I should go to college. He was a factor in my starting my educational journey. And so God used 2 different men from 2 different religions and races to help me become the person I am today. And so when I look at the lies that we're telling our children, all of our children, we're telling the Black children that they're victims, and we're telling the white children that they are guilty of blood guilt because of the conditions that they see in society. And so we are not giving our children the tools that they need for success. And I want to tell you that this book is one of the most important books I've read in recent years. And I believe that in a world where people wanted answers, it would be on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's not a book about race. This whole idea of agency is something that all of our children need. And so I think Ian is the perfect messenger to sort of bridge the gap, but he needs all of us to help get the word out about what this book has in its content, and it's well documented. It's very scholarly. And so I just hope it reaches the people that need to read it.
And we're gonna,
Wow, I think the panel is done. That's great.
well, we're going to speak that into existence. You know, we're going to call this agency as a bestseller. It's a TPPF bestseller.
You have to dream it. It's very true.
Yeah, we can invoke positive thought.
Yes.
Let me tell you,
Important part of
Ian,
agency, actually.
I am so excited, Ian, reading this book, reading your book, Agency, and seeing you invoke the principles and ideas and thoughts and concepts of not just Martin Luther King. We all invoke Martin, I mean, all the time, but to reach into Martin Seligman and also to Albert Bandura,
Yes.
and to get into the psychological world, you know, positive psychology, and be able to determine. And you have a statement in your book here, and it's so powerful. All three men stress the social forces from a range of morally formative institutions can create the conditions under which young people exercise free will and build the mental muscle of agency.
Yes.
Talk a little bit about that.
Yes, the mental muscle of agency. So as you mentioned in my introduction, you know, for the last decade plus, I've run schools in the heart of the South Bronx, Lower East Side of Manhattan. You know, worked with kids in very challenging situations. You know, the schools I led, we had more than 2,000 students, almost all low-income kids, almost all Black and Hispanic. And the reason I run schools, in addition to doing all this other work and writing, but I want to run schools in the real world because I want my students to know that they can do hard things. And what I've really observed, particularly over the last couple of years, accelerated since George Floyd, has been these dominant meta-narratives that, in my view, are trying to convince young people of all the things that they can't do. And so the first meta-narrative I call blame the system, which is what you're describing, which is America is systemically oppressive. That if you're a young person of a certain skin color, a certain gender, any one of a host of characteristics, the systems are rigged against you. They're so discriminatory, so overwhelming, so powerful that you are powerless in terms of your individual ability to overcome these hurdles. So theories like critical race theory, anti-racist doctrine, all those things rob young people of this sense of agency. And simultaneously, there's also this other narrative, which is like called blame the victim, which is that if you're not successful in this country, it's not America that's the problem, you're the problem. Somehow you didn't pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. You're the architect of your own failure. You haven't taken advantage of all the opportunities that this great country has provided. The problem, of course, with that narrative is that if you're a young person, it's really hard to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps if you were born into an unstable family, or if you have not had the support of a strong faith community, or you haven't had access to great schools through school choice. And so these two meta-narratives of blame the system and blame the victim, to me, add up to a singular lie that robs young people of their ability to know that they can lead a self-determined life. So rather than just document the problem and shout in the rain, I thought it very important that I create the empowering alternative. What's the answer? What is it we can share with young people that tells them they don't have to be victims? They don't have to follow this narrative. And I've done a ton of research over the years of what makes it. And I've had kids who live in homeless shelters, who are in foster care, who are poor, who live in poverty, all sorts of situations. Some kids thrive. Some kids succumb to those conditions and recreate them in their own lives. But other kids have managed to thrive in young adulthood. What makes the difference? And so in trying to think about what makes a difference, I really dived into the work of Martin Luther King, Marty Seligman, Albert Bandura. And in case of Bandura, they developed theories of this idea of self-efficacy.
Mhm.
So, right, this idea of understanding that within you, within every young person, are the tools of self-renewal, self-betterment, self-improvement that can enhance your capacity to overcome your existing circumstance, but it doesn't come from nowhere. So the concept of agency, it's individually practiced, but socially empowered, right? So I define agency as the force of your free will guided by moral discernment, So think of agency like a vector, like velocity. Velocity is not just speed, it's speed and direction. So Bandura and Seligman and Dr. King all talk about the importance of mediating institutions to help build the capacity of young people to know how to exercise their free will in such a way that they understand what is right and wrong and what's best in their own individual story.
Dr. Swain, how is the current culture and the current environment impacting young folks' free will and agency and to think in a moral sense? How you write a lot about that and how the impact of CRT and how it's
Right.
burning down the house.
Yeah, and the thing you mentioned about blame the victim, CRT argues for the most part that all white people are oppressors and that racism is in the DNA of the US and that only white people can be racist and that all minorities are victims. And so for white people, all the responsibility is on their shoulders. And then they tell us that racism is permanent. There's nothing you can do about it. And just think about the poor whites that are in Appalachia, the young white kid whose parents never finished the second grade, that's in generational poverty. And he's told that he has white privilege because of the color of his skin and that he's responsible for the fact that he can't read and he lives in a shack. And so young white people that are poor, I mean, they are being victimized by this ideology, as well as racial and ethnic minorities from all backgrounds who are being told that because of systemic racism, what they can't do. And CRT is a racist ideology. It's a white supremacist ideology because it argues that white people control all the power over everyone else's fate. And it is very destructive. And ultimately, you know, it's not really about making the world, more equal. During the time that I got my education, the focus was on equal opportunity. I took advantage of equal opportunity. I had an equal opportunity to fail or to succeed. That was the world I grew up in. That's not what they're telling people today. They're telling people that minorities are victims. You have to lower the standards for them. You know, the math is racist, and I can tell you that I struggled with math. I was not naturally inclined in that way. I was an honors student because I chose a major that didn't have a lot of math in it. And that was a choice that I made, but I had the ability to make that choice. And what I see them doing is destroying the future of generations of young people that came behind me at a time when it's never been better, I think, for racial and ethnic minorities as far as opportunities. It should be the best time ever, but the messages make it the worst time ever because all of them are being told, regardless of their socioeconomic status, what they can't do. And so I think that we need to realize that the CRT, critical race theory, is a critical theory that the people that are pushing that at its root is Marxism. And it's also connected to the critical queer theory that's leading to the transgenderism of children, critical feminist theory that's emasculating our males. All of these destructive theories are not about making our society better. It's about destroying our institutions, the families, the churches, the governmental institutions, the schools. All of these things are part of a plan. And we would be, very foolish if we just focused on one part of it. And the solution is agency, and it's knowledge and getting truth out and letting people know what's happening to them. And I can tell you that the anti-CRT movement is not a white movement. It is not a white mom's movement. You find immigrants helping lead that movement. You find Blacks that don't want their children to be told that they're victims and that that they can't learn math. Math is hard, at least for people like me. And so parents want their children, to learn, the people that love their children. And so I think that it seems dismal that society is moving in the wrong direction, but I am encouraged because there are more and more people that are seeing through what's taking place. And it is a bipartisan movement. It cuts across race, it cuts across religion. And I think Ian's book is not a conservative Republican book. Anyone from the left that's watching this is not a book about conservatism. This is a book that has just practical advice and hard science and people that are cited that most scholars would say, these are the cutting edge individuals, but somehow we've lost sight of what they taught us.
Yeah, I hated math.
You hate what?
I hated math. Wait, until I opened up my business. Now, when I started my business, I love math.
Hey,
Because
I
love, know what I came to love about math?
what?
My revenues and my expenditures
Right.
and my profits and the distance between the two.
Right. I
Exactly.
can read a P&L statement, and I have a great bookkeeper and a great CPA. And yeah, I'm interested in some numbers, but I can tell you with math, I struggled. And at the community college, I took remedial math. But to get my PhD, I had to learn how to interpret a regression. I had to learn to get through
Statistics.
stats, and it was
Sure.
hard.
And that's a great segue into our next point. I want to talk a little bit about the success sequence. And this is a real turning point for me in your book, because it seems so simple, Ian. It seems so simple. If you just finish school, get a job, before you have children, you have a 98% chance to escape poverty.
Yes.
Tell us about
So, and I should share just a quick story based on everything you just said about this narrative that's out there, all these things you can't do. Many people may be familiar with Nicole Hannah-Jones. She's one of the lead authors of the New York Times 1619 Project. And she wrote a New York Times Magazine 8,000-word essay called What is Owed? And it's basically this treatise about how Black people are powerless to close the racial wealth gap unless there is a massive, 13 or 14 trillion dollar reparations program. And in this piece, she says, it doesn't matter what a Black person does. Doesn't matter if you get married. Doesn't matter if you get educated. Doesn't matter if you buy a home. Doesn't matter if you save.
Did she do any of those things?
Well, hold on, because that's the irony. She says none of those things can overcome, quote, 400 years of racialized plundering, right? And so you just think about this message, and there are people who've adopted that ideology and now spreading that in schools. And yes, the irony is that Nicole Hannah-Jones has done all four of those things in her own life to lead a quite prosperous existence. And good for her, because she's embraced the institutions that make such a huge difference. The racial wealth gap, it is true. If you look at the 2019 survey of consumer finances, if you look at race alone, the average average white family has about $160,000 more wealth than the average Black family. But if you take into account just two factors, family structure and level of education, the average Black married college educated family has about $160,000 more wealth than the average white single parent family. So perhaps there are factors beyond race that can make a huge difference in what the life outcomes are for a kid of any race. So this is where the success sequence is so important, because there's a big difference between a narrative of it doesn't matter any of these things that you can do, you're not going to be able to be financially successful. And how about a message which says, data shows if you finish just your high school degree, get a full-time job of any kind, just so you learn the dignity and discipline of work, and if you have children, marriage first. The data shows that 97% of millennials avoid poverty. Don't you think we should
Who
teach
wouldn't
that
want
to
that?
young people? Well, I've actually asked that question to a group of ninth graders in New Orleans. I visited a high school. I was facing controversy in New York when we were trying to teach this in schools. I asked this group of ninth graders, if you knew that there were a series of decisions in your control, that data shows that when people followed these decisions, 97% avoid poverty, would you want to know that?
Everybody raise their hand.
And they looked at me and said, of course I'd want to know that. Why wouldn't I want to know that? And then I said, well, there's some grown-ups who claim to speak for you, who think we shouldn't tell you because you might be insulted or it might offend your families. And so, you know what? Just better not to tell you at all. And they looked at me like I literally had a third eye. What are you talking about? Why would you withhold this information with me? Tell us. And so we proceeded to have this conversation about this thing called the success sequence. And the way I framed the discussion was not in a prescriptive fashion saying, you must do this. It was more a descriptive saying, look, in the next 8 to 10 years of your life, you're in ninth grade, you're going to be making decisions about your education, your work, relationships, family formation. So I want you to know that there are different series of decisions that you can make. And you should know the likely rewards or consequences associated with those different series of decisions, where the success sequence is just one. This has a 97% probability of avoiding poverty, but these are other scenarios that have a much greater likelihood of being in poverty. And at the end of the conversation, what I felt, these students felt, was that they were respected as future decision makers in their own life. And that is what I am trying to cultivate, a sense of agency, that it's a force of your free will guided by moral discernment, where that moral discernment is informed by information that we all know is really, it's just common sense, right? But there is an opposition to empowering young people with this kind of information. And we need the courage to stand strong in the faces of those self-anointed people who claim to be acting in the interests, particularly of low-income people, and honestly, to ignore the gatekeepers and provide the information that's so critical to build agency in the rising generation.
Dr. Swain, I see you
really
chomping
have a
at the
lot to
bit.
say. And some of it has to do with the fact that when I was getting my education and being pushed forward, because I never sought to get a PhD, it was people that kept pushing me in circumstances that before I knew it, I was in a graduate program. But it was in graduate school where I learned the theories of oppression, and that I was not supposed to do any of the things that I had already accomplished. And by then it was too late because I was already a success. But had I heard that, early on, I don't know that I would have had the incentive to keep going. And what has dismayed me most, the places where I've been, the other Blacks around me, minorities, were mostly affluent. I mean, there were some from working class backgrounds, but for the most part, they were more affluent. And they were riddled with, I think, Black guilt. And they did not, these were people often that they were struggling, academically, but they had a sense that they were owed something. And I think that among the affluent, we talk about white guilt. I think there's a Black guilt among Blacks who have been successful, and they will stand in front of high school students or young people and say that America is more racist today than it's ever been, and they will focus on what you can't do. And I've seen this taking place, for the last 20, 30 years. They have been sending out these negative messages, some of the most affluent Blacks. And you think about Derek Bell, he's considered the father of CRT. He was Harvard University's law school's first tenured Black professor. And what did his message? He started CRT. And he argued that everything that white people did during the civil rights movement, whenever they did anything that seemingly benefited Blacks, it was really about themselves.
Yeah. I think everybody in the audience want to be free. Does everybody out here want to be free? Let's see hands want to be free. Everybody out here wants to be free. We're going to get in the meat of this discussion, meat of agency right now.
Everyone wants to be free, but not everyone wants the responsibility of being free.
But we're going to talk about free because you bring free to a whole nother level in your book, Agency. And I want to start with the F, family. Let's talk about that family. And you say it's not what family you come from, it's what family you form.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Yeah. So my empowering alternative for agency, how do you actually make this happen? The kids that I've seen be successful over time usually have been successful in young adulthood and beyond is because they've formed a strong family, they've had a strong faith commitment, they've had access to a great education, and that foundation has usually led to some kind of entrepreneurial activity. And we can go through each of the four, but I call this framework FREE: family, religion, education, and entrepreneurship. I don't call it EARF, right? I don't reverse it because F is the most important. It's the foundation. And this is a really important point. It's not about the family that you're from. It's about the family that you form. And I've had kids in my schools from every kind of family. And let me just make it abundantly clear, simply because a child is born into a single parent household doesn't mean that means that their life is guaranteed to be a failure, nor is being born into a married two-parent household a guarantee of success. So there are always exceptions, because the data is overwhelming, though, that married two-parent households are far stronger setting to raise young people. In the Black community, the poverty rate amongst married Black folks has been in the single digits for as long as the records have been kept. I mean, that's, but when do you hear that? And so family is the foundation that I want to help young people think about in terms of the formation of their own family. So that's why teaching things like the success sequence in a descriptive fashion in middle and high school, I think is a necessary precondition. In the schools that we're leading, that I just opened in the Bronx at Vertex Partnership Academies, we're going to have a class called Pathways to Power. And in that class, we will be talking to kids about making their future plans 10 to 12 years from now. What do you want to be doing? You're in 9th grade right now. 10 to 12 years from now, where do you want to be? And, it's very interesting. And then we ask, what are the obstacles to getting there? It's almost always because a lot of these kids have seen that family formation in their neighbors has been a huge impediment. And so we say, okay, well, if that's something that you see as a challenge, here's some information that will help you make decisions about your own family. And for me, it's if we really were to dissect almost every issue we care about, incarceration, healthcare, poor educational outcomes, crime, almost every social issue that we all care about, if you reverse integrate, it is almost always the case, the structure and stability of the families for which there's a negative side of that statistic, family structure plays a huge role, that we need to be honest and have the courage to acknowledge that these are huge issues. And so therefore, we need to teach the rising generation of how not to create these issues in the first place.
Well,
Dr.
may I
Swain,
say
Dr.
something?
Swain, I'm gonna bring you in
Okay.
because I want you to talk about the R in free. I want you to talk about the religion in free, because
Okay.
you speak about that in your book, how Christianity helped shape America. What's going on right now in our society? Because Ian points out in his book the need for good, sound moral values that are perpetuated in religion. What's going on right now, and what do we need to do to get on the right track?
I mean, I will talk about religion, But one of the reasons why your book is sold 10,000 copies or so rather than 100,000 or 1,000,000 is because you stand up for family, and the political left, the media elites and the people that control access, they very much believe that that family structure, there's no one superior family structure. And so they are denying people, the very things that they have, the progressives, the ones that support the attacks on families. Look at their families and look how they raise their children. And so that's part of what's being attacked. And the Marxism at the root goes at religion. And we do know that from studies back in the 1930s and 40s of people who were successful that came out of housing projects, for the most part, the ones that were successful came out of stable Christian homes. They were churchgoers. And in the Black community, it was the church that sustained, generations of African Americans, and the family was stable. And it was the 1960s, the turmoils of the 1960s, when you get the movements, the various movements, but also the attacks on the marriage, no fault divorce. When Daniel Patrick Moynihan, 1965, pointed out that some dysfunction was happening in the Black community. At that time, 25% of Black households were headed by a single females. Well, now it's over 70%. And so all of this dysfunction, Judeo-Christian values, supports the institution of the family. And that is something that the progressives, the cultural Marxism, they have to go after religion, because religion stood in the way of this vision they've had for our society. And because a lot of us were not paying attention, we allowed them to seemingly gain the upper hand right now. And so religion has been a stabilizing force in our society. And, Christianity, but if you look at within the Muslim community and other faith communities as well, there are values and principles that people have that would be stabilizing. And the political left has to attack any form of religion because it undermines their power and what they want to do with the state.
Right now, and Ian, Dr. Swain hit on something very strong. The media is, they took critical race theory up and they just spent hundreds of millions of dollars in marketing critical race theory. Agency is the counter alternative to critical race theory from what I've read. And we're in now this education space. Some folks say that education is the new civil rights movement. Mm-hmm. This is where this is ground zero. And you write in your book that only 2% of high school graduates can do basic reading and math without requiring remediation.
Yes. Well, all that time we've been debating critical race theory. As we just learned a few weeks ago, we've lost 2 decades of progress academically for 9-year-old students.
Wow.
9-year-old students, according to the National Assessment for Educational Progress. This is the problem. There's like the shiny object. There's CRT, there's anti-racism. Meanwhile, our kids are not reading.
Opportunity costs, right?
And by the way, this is what I call the equal opportunity tsunami. We often talk about the racial achievement gap in reading. It is true. There's definitely been a gap between Black and white students. But in the entire history of the National Assessment for Educational Progress, what's called the nation's report card, there has never been a situation where even a majority of white students are reading at grade level. It's about 44, 45%. So even if we did close the racial achievement gap in reading, all we would have achieved is universal mediocrity, right? And so the reason it's important to say that is that it's unlikely that systemic racism is the reason that the majority of white kids have not been able to read at grade level for generations. Maybe there are issues like lack of stability within homes, because by the way, the non-marital birth rate in the white community is now far higher than it was in the Black community when Moynihan wrote that report. So not enough school choice. That statistic, that 2%, That's in the district where I ran schools in the South Bronx. Only 2% of kids graduate from high school ready for college. These are the structural barriers that we should really be focused on if we truly want to create agency, more equality of opportunity for all kids. And yet we get distracted by these perverse theories like critical race theory that are selling a narrative that damages all kids.
I want to do one thing because we got to get entrepreneurship in the last E, and then we got to go to Q&A because we're back up against the wall on the clock.
Okay.
Let's get the last E in
Yes.
from free. I want to be totally free.
Yes. Well,
And
right.
talk a little bit about entrepreneurship, that component, and then we'll go into Q&A. We'll hear from Dr. Swain, then we'll go right into
Yes. And
Q&A.
and quickly, the reason I did include R in free is because the power of a personal faith commitment. When you look at the levels of loneliness, depression, isolation that exists for young people, we're at urgent levels of mental health issues. And yet when you look at those same data for young people who do have a personal faith commitment or are supported by a strong faith community, much lower levels of loneliness, isolation, depression. So helping more young people understand the power, and whether it's Christianity, Buddhism, it almost doesn't matter. As long as it's a religious belief with a strong moral code, that's really important. We know these things. We need the courage to say obvious things. Okay, entrepreneurship. If you form a strong family, have a strong faith commitment, have had access to a great school through school choice, great education, that usually means that you have a foundation where you can be more entrepreneurial. And that could mean starting your own business. Even if you're working for a company, you have more of an entrepreneurial mindset because you can be more of an informed risk taker over your own life. And I use the example in the book of Booker T. Washington during Jim Crow segregation, where he had the idea to build a network of nearly 5,000 schools across the South because he was dissatisfied with the quality of education that Black students were getting. He partnered with Julius Rosenwald, who at the time was the CEO of the Sears Roebuck Company, but they had an entrepreneurial idea to make things better for a whole group of people. And that's the spirit that I'm trying to foster with the last E of entrepreneurship.
Great. Now we come to the best part of let's hear from Dr. Swain, then we'll go into Q&A.
Well,
You
I'm very
wanted to make a comment.
concerned about the fact that instead of focusing on educating all of our children academically, that the progressives have even gone into the elite private schools and they're focused on, the social emotional learning, and they're focused on, the gender ideology and the sexualization of our children. That has taken priority. And as a consequence, our children in the United States have fallen behind children in other nations where they still emphasize academics. And I believe ultimately it's about bringing down the United States. They don't want America to be, the first world power. They don't want us to have that kind of influence. And so what are they doing? They're dumbing down the education of all of our children.
That's why I really, really like the NAEP data that basically suggests that, Catholic schools during the pandemic, other schools closed, Catholic schools stayed open, and Catholic schools have outperformed, students have outperformed public school students for the last 20 years in math, reading, and science. But let's open this up now for
CRT is
Q&A.
in the Catholic schools too.
I know, but the Catholic dioceses have started to shut those down. But let's open up now for our Q&A. I see a hand right here, and the microphone is coming your way.
Hi, well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the talk. It's really fascinating. I can't wait to read the book. I'm a product of a graduate school of education. In 1997, I went into a class and the professor started on the first day, said the operating assumption of everything that we're going to learn in this class is that the individual is completely overwhelmed by the society.
Oof.
They do not have power to overcome any sort of the negative, systemically racist and oppressive structures of our society.
Okay.
So let's talk about the engines that perpetuate this basically disempowering of the individual. Right?
There you go. Just a little housekeeping. Let's make sure that a question mark ends at each one.
Yeah. So that was a question. No, this is a very real issue. I was asked to do a couple of debates on C-SPAN on critical race theory, and the opponent in my debate was a professor at Bryn Mawr College, who is she's training the next generation of teachers, and this is an expert on critical race theory. And over the course of the debate, one of the callers asked, how does your ideology, because she was promoting a lot of the things that you're talking about, how does that align with the work of Dr. Thomas Sowell? And she said, who's Thomas Sowell? Right. So this is an expert on critical race theory. And so this is a very big issue. Typically when you're recruiting teachers, the things that are most important to you are pedagogy, subject matter knowledge. But now ideological framing is a very important thing to screen for. So even in the hiring of teachers for our network, Vertex Partnership Academies that we just opened, we had every applicant for a teaching role watch the debate that I did on critical race theory on C-SPAN to say, are you okay to work for someone who's founded an organization who has these beliefs? And the conversation was, very constructive. I thought it was a healthy debate. I think I won. But the point is, this has become a real issue where schools of education, unfortunately, are imparting a lot of this ideology. And thankfully, I think more and more parents are hearing this now in the classroom, and visibility during COVID, I think, helped. So a lot of parents are now pushing back. But it is a challenge for schools of education, I think, is one upon us, that we have to push back to say this is not an ideology that ultimately helps children.
Hi, my question is, how would you contrast your approach to solving the education problem with the approach of Roland F.R.E.E?
Oh, well, Roland F.R.E.E, who's a great economist and researcher, he did a study many years ago, actually, I think based in Houston, where he analyzed a number of charter schools, versus district schools. He looked at those schools that were high performing, and he isolated what I think were 5 specific characteristics that are repeatable. That for schools that are really successful, these are the things that exist, and it had to do with things like high expectations, strong leaders. There wasn't any, you need anti-racist ideology or you need critical race theory. There was none of that, right? There were certain aspects of what he felt were just endemic to strong schools. So I actually think there's a lot of alignment with the things that I would advocate for. So even in the school that we're launching, we're seeking authorization to become an international baccalaureate school. It is a world-class education in the heart of a community where in our district, only 7% of kids that start 9th grade 4 years later graduate from high school ready for college. But we're bringing a world-class curriculum that will allow students to, at the end of sophomore year, choose to pursue the diploma pathway, which is more traditional, or college or university path, or they can choose the international baccalaureate careers pathway, where they can pursue a professional credential in a particular industry area. So consider they could be graduating from high school, being able to be a computer programmer immediately to go work at Google, for example. That's an example of the kinds of design, high expectations, strong leadership, strong professional development that I think very much aligns with what Roland F.R.E.E has described in his work.
Dr. Swain, we're going to take an online question. It says, how does CRT oppress people of color? Question, first part. Second part, is teaching self-efficacy the answer?
How does CRT oppress people of color?
Yeah.
Because it
That's the first
tells
part.
them what they can't do. It tells them that they're victims, that they have no agency, that it infantilizes them. It tells them that white people control their fate. And so it's very destructive as far as achievement, but it also violates the law. It violates the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Equal Protection Clause, because it discriminates. It resegregates Black kids. Often there's segregation, whether at the college level or at K through 12, that they are being resegregated and they are being held to lower standards. And we fought a civil rights movement against discrimination, and it certainly discriminates against whites because many white children are being shamed and bullied because of the color of their skin, and they're harming all of our children. And what was the second part?
Is teaching self-efficacy the answer?
I don't, yeah, I mean, the thing about it is there will be some people that would naturally have agency. Like I came from a family that was totally dysfunctional. 12 kids, I was the one that got out, and someone told me I couldn't do something, I was going to show them that I could. And so there will be some people that are sort of wired that way. But for others, I think the power of words can change lives. And the programs that have been successful is you plant that seed and you can change people's lives. So planting the seed of hope. So yeah, teaching agency, planting that seed of hope, dispelling the lies, because we're telling our children lies and we're having our teachers teach lies. And as a university professor, I taught lies.
And
Wow, what a revelation.
yeah. And let me just quickly add to how does CRT, adversely affect kids of color and kids of all races. There's a theory and then there's the practice. So there's a lawsuit right now in Evanston, Illinois, where the superintendent endorsed the practice of what's called privilege walks. And in privilege walks, imagine a scenario where this is a classroom of, a multiracial classroom. The teacher lines all the kids up in a horizontal line and then says, if you're white, take 3 steps forward. If you're Black, take 6 steps backward. And there are a series of questions that are just supposed to prove your inherent privilege or your inherent oppression. Literally, in the lesson plan in Evanston, Illinois, white students were supposed to learn about their, quote, internalized dominance, end quote. It's like we're trying to create little white supremacists, right? And so, but the good news is that case is now being adjudicated as a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And the reason this is important is that we already have the apparatus to fight a lot of these practices that are intentionally segregating kids by race. You'll have schools that are doing professional development. Well, they'll send the white teachers over here, the non-white teachers here. The white teachers have to struggle with all their inherent privilege. It's illegal. And the more and more, I think, more superintendents, more parents, more school boards recognize that this isn't just bad theory, it actually violates the law, that then hopefully we'll come back to our senses. And oh, by the way, get back to the fact that only 37% of all kids are reading at grade level.
Let me tell you this, like with CRT, they're telling our parents when they raise issues about it, oh no, that's a college level philosophy. That privilege walk has been around for 30 years. And it was in the college classes, usually sociology. And so they've taken all of these theories, these bad theories, and taken it down to the K through 12 level. And so I think that it not only does it violate the law, more and more white people need to think like racial and ethnic minorities and learn how to gather data about discrimination. They need to know their rights, and they need to file lawsuits. And I think that there are lawsuits taking place across the country. There's some that have already been settled, and that at the end of the day, that may be the way we stop CRT. But because the left is so determined, they'll keep at it. They'll keep trying to bring it back. But I think this blatant violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and of the Equal Protection Clause of the Constitution, if we adhere, to the law and to our Constitution, it has to end. And what's so troubling today is that we had a civil rights movement and we ended, discrimination under the law, but it has flipped now. And white people in the 1970s, 80s, they said they suffered from reverse discrimination and people laughed. they shouldn't be laughing now because it's discrimination that's out in the open and it's unacceptable. It's not ever acceptable to shame or bully anyone's child because of the color of their skin, or to tell any person that because of their sex or because of their race or because of their sexual orientation or anything that they can't talk or they can't speak or somehow they are an oppressor.
One of the things is sometimes the best defense is a great offense. And Ian, I want to thank you for giving us a tool in agency to be not take a defensive stand, but now we can get on the offensive. We have this tool.
What do we want young people to say yes to?
We have this tool that now that we can use this to get on the offensive and we can talk about agency. We not talk about CRT, let's talk about agency. Let's uplift the principles that are in this book. Martin Luther King said it best. He said, one cannot begin to live until he can rise above the narrow confinements of his own individualistic concerns to the broader concerns of all humanity. I want to thank Ian Rowe, and I want to thank Dr. Swain for living.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.